Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 43 of my game system design series. In this video I'll investigate Napoleonic figure gaming but rules basing. Something I never imagined I would ever do, but I found this topic so complex and malleable as to warrant a detailed analysis of how Napoleonic figure gamers have dealt with basing over the last, let's say, 50 years. My guess is the first ever figure gaming, or at least modern figure gaming, was Napoleonic, or at least mid-19th century gaming, both due to the Germans and later in the 19th century the English. The English had the greater focus on the use of figures, so I expect it's where it really began. Being first has a lot of advantages, which is maximum flexibility, and disadvantages, nothing to build upon, so I expect a lot of ideas were tried. The other issue is we know enough about Napoleonic warfare to be dangerous, but not enough to be certain. The result is the most complex range of basing styles of any figure gaming period. The first topic to cover is figure size. Infantry with an outstretched gun will normally be about 3 centimeters deep for 25mm, 2.5 centimeters for 20mm, 2 centimeters for 15mm, and 1 centimeters for 6mm. Obviously, infantry with the gun pointed up will take much less depth, but I'm showing the maximum depth to give you an idea if the figure's gun extends beyond the base. Generally, in terms of a base depth for cavalry, the values are double that of infantry. Typically 6 centimeters for 25, 5 centimeters for 20, 4 centimeters for 15mm, and 2 centimeters for 6mm. Artillery tends to be a fairly complex topic. If we look at 12-pounders, which are pretty much the largest guns, then we're probably looking at 3 times depth that of the infantry. 9 centimeters for 25, 7.5 for 20mm, 6 centimeters for 15mm, and 3 centimeters for 6mm. Smaller guns would obviously be closer to that of cavalry. In fact, 6-pounder and bottom, or probably actually 9-pounder and smaller would be the same as cavalry depth. Let's now drill into the history before 1971. In the first WRG Napoleonic rules, there is a sentence which states most players use a figure base width of 1/2 inch for infantry and 3/4 inch for cavalry. However, these sizes were designed for 20mm figures, and the new 25mm figures would no longer fit on them. These sizes that you see here are based on that statement. In this particular case, I'm uncertain what the width for bases for artillery figures were, and I'm uncertain what the depth of the bases would have been as well. But I suspect the infantry bases were square and the cavalry bases only deep enough to fit the figures on them, so may have been 1 inch in depth. When we move up to the concept of units, that is more than one figure, there is no real mention of how to base these. The concept of elements did not seem to exist in the really old days, and players put these figures together as they saw fit. This actually matches up with my original basing of Confederate airfix figures on square individual bases, which I have to admit was an incredibly painful experience to game with. The Confederates, in my case, the Confederates sort of looked like Austrian troops, and Union troops sort of looked like Prussians or French, so I did mainly use them for the Austro-Prussian Wars and the Franco-Prussian Wars. When WRG Wargame Rules 1750 to 1850 came out in January 71, it changed the base sizes to metric and slightly increased the sizes of some bases to accommodate the new 25mm figures, I would imagine. This shows the bases with 20mm figures on them. 25mm figures, except the artillery, would require a slightly deeper base. In this set of rules, WRG suggested you mount the figures together into company or squadron size formations, the first possible reference to elements. As the figure scale was 20:1, I expect this was an element of between 4 and 6 figures, depending on the size of the company or squadron. However, most players would keep their figures separate for flexibility, at least at this point in time in the history of gaming. Another set of rules, the TTG set of rules, which came out in 1975, moved the basing back to the old 20mm or airfix size base sizes. Once again, no real concept of elements in these rules, although figures were grouped together to form what was called units. I found the artillery bases incredibly large, considering only one gun was placed on the base. I'm wondering if I made an error in my reading of the rules. But I have the copy of the rules, and that's exactly what it says. If we flip over to the US, one thing that you'll notice is the basing systems in the UK and the US developed separately. However, the earliest rules in the US also used the system of basing by figures rather than by elements. This is about the earliest US source rules I could find, First Empire, so I have to assume other rules in the US of the same period were similar. The basing does seem rather small for 25mm figures, so I'm assuming the basing sizes are for 15mm rather than 25mm figures. I suspect 20mm figures may fit on these bases as well. I'm showing 15mm figures on these bases, and they seem reasonable, particularly the infantry, although a little bit small for cavalry and artillery. As far as I can identify, the WRG rules were the first which based figures by elements. Each element consisted of between 1 and 4 figures. WRG also provided basing for 6mm, which was the first 6mm basing I've ever seen in any rules. They may have even called it 5mm, I can't remember at this point in time. The other interesting trend was when 15mm figures turned into actually 18mm figures, they became difficult to base on the early WRG element base sizes. Ancients went down the path of 4cm wide bases, but unless the current version of the Napoleonic rules at Lulu has made this change, I'm not aware of any changes in basing for these slightly larger figures, at least for WRG. WRG did make a reasonable amount of effort in getting the frontage to match those of real life, although it was certainly not perfect. If all the cavalry were based 2 per base, then the cavalry, close order infantry and artillery were about as perfect as you could get in terms of average frontages. The skirmish density was probably not accurate. A more accurate frontage would be half that provided, but I expect the 2 figures per base was to make the bases look nicer. This shows the 25mm basing for the WRG rules dated 1979. I've not shown irregular cavalry due to lack of space. The basing has changed per figure a bit compared with the first edition of WRG, but not really by much. WRG clearly was focused on making all the elements the same width, only the artillery not fitting into this scheme due to an attempt to retain as much historical flexibility and accuracy as possible. The figures were now mainly used for casualty purposes only, that is individual figures. Combat was element-based with these set of rules. Flipping over to the US, Empire 3rd edition still determined base size by individual figures, but it was recommending players to base more than one figure together. Cavalry would be based into squadrons and infantry into companies, or some logical organisational structure as per the player's personal preference. Saying this, the rules did state any basing system could be used, but this would require some level of house rules to be implemented, which was not really perfect. The Empire 3rd edition still listed 25mm basing first, but the examples were all 15mm figures, so I have to assume these rules were probably mainly aimed at 15mm players. I have no idea why Austrian cavalry between 1792 and 1805 should have smaller frontages than other cavalry. The French in 1815 charged with a frontage of 1 metre per horse, which leaves almost no room on either side. Perhaps the Austrians had very thin horses. The basing values shown now are for version 4 of another set of rules, US, called Commander, but my understanding is basing did not change from the first edition, so this represented the first example of elements from a US source. If the first edition retained the same basing as the fourth edition, then these rules were likely the origin of the US basing system of 2 by 2, that is 2 figures up front, 2 figures to the rear, which could have also come from American Civil War rules, which this company also published. I, for one, was surprised Corps Commander was first published in 1988. I thought it was a much later set of rules. Another US set of rules, Napoleonic Battles, was published by Avalon Hill back in the 1980s, which did surprise me, as Avalon Hill is more commonly known for its board gaming. It's used as a form of a base point by many players, and in their day were very popular, although I suspect they are not used very much these days, but they are constantly referred to by gamers on social network or social media. I suspect outside the US they did not gain the same level of popularity as within the US, but within the US these rules are certainly held up as some sort of pivotal or game-changing set of rules. I was also independently told these set of rules was the most common source of the 2x2 basing scheme used in many latter US rules, although I have to admit Corps Commander predated these rules by 1 year, so it could be, I think, technically the origin, but maybe both set of rules independently came up with this scheme. Saying that, the players I'm aware of do not typically use this basing, especially for cavalry, so I'm not certain if this basing was the preferred option and other options are available in the rules. The cavalry were often based 1 row per base, unlike 2 rows per base, which is the recommended basing. The artillery basing was also commonly changed to 1.5 inch wide, but I must admit not knowing why this was the case. Sharko, another set of rules, which came out in 1995, allowed players to use any number of different basing systems, 4 for infantry, 3 for cavalry, 2 for artillery, and an optional skirmish base type. I've provided the combination which all use a standard base width of 1.25 inches, but players can base infantry 3 figures wide or 2 wide and 2 deep as well. I'm uncertain what the recommended basing should actually be, but I expect the game system is not super focused on specific element widths. The interesting point about the basing for these set of rules is the skirmish base, which provides a reasonably realistic skirmish density. The skirmish base can also be 1 inch deep if players wish. By 1995, there were at least 3 well-established basing systems: 3 cm wide with 3 figures, 4 cm wide with 4 figures, and 2 cm wide with 4 figures in 2 ranks. These 3 systems are still used today, so I would suggest the basing standards had been set, at least by 1995. WRG Ancient probably set the 4 cm wide basing standard. Corps Commander or Napoleon's Battle set the 2x2 basing standard, and I must admit not knowing the origin of the 3-figure 3 cm wide standard basing, but it must have been a set of rules prior to 1995. It should be noted the original WRG Napoleonics was a 3 cm wide base, but it recommended 4 figures on that base. Of course, 6mm was to upset the apple cart, but for now we have some level of common systems of a sort. Moving to more modern sets of rules, General de Broglie, they provide basing values for figures which are variable. However, they advise players to base these figures into elements of 6 to 8 infantry per base in 2 ranks. I've shown a 8-figure infantry base, but the 3 is also permitted. The 2-rank 4 cm wide base with 8 figures is 2 ranks. In 2 ranks is a new type of basing system, but the exact system never really caught on until DBN came along, and even then this basing was optional and didn't really get that popular. Grande Armée is what I call big base set of rules, with each big base being 3 inch square, and players can place anything they wish on the base. The players need to keep track of the status of the big base using counters or written records, which is not something I particularly like. I've shown an example of 15mm figures. I suspect this may work better with 6mm figures. Some players I know use 3 cm square bases and reduce the playing area accordingly. This works well with 6mm figures. I personally would go with 6 cm bases and would use 6mm figures, which I suspect is an option. As it turned out, in the end I went down the 3 cm square base because I wanted to reduce the playing area size. This kind of diorama system shines with 6mm figures, which we'll see in the 6mm basing systems that we'll cover in a moment. I placed it here because it was the first occurrence of this kind of basing I'm aware of. It did have its downsides, but if gamers' focus was bling and diorama, it was a good choice. Milan came from Australia and adopted a reasonably standard WRG-like basing system, except the bases were now 4 cm wide instead of 3 cm wide. This is probably what WRG would have looked like if it was upgraded to accommodate 18mm figures. It's also possible that the edited version of the old WRG rules may well have been modified to include this spacing system. I may purchase a copy one day to find out. Garde du Corps 3rd edition, which are now free rules available to anyone who wishes to get a copy, uses the basing system from Napoleon's battles. The interesting point is they now use the correct frontage for cavalry compared with infantry, as well as separate skirmish half bases. I suspect the half bases are used to avoid double basing, thus the actual frontage of these bases is double what you see here. Many sets of rules avoid double basing by the use of half bases, expecting the players to ensure the half bases are correctly spaced where they need to go. This works, but I must admit I prefer double basing my figures. When I use the term double basing, I mean the base actually reflects the true width that the skirmishers occupy, instead of an individual base with gaps between them. I personally think it simply looks better on the playing area. Age of Eagles is very much element focused, and the number of figures on the base is not important. What is important is the historical strength of what the base represents. As a result, for artillery, the base width varies based on the actual number of guns in the battery. The infantry could be based into double bases, but the unit always needs some standard size bases for casualty purposes. When I first created this video, I did not like the US basing system, but today I actually prefer it. So if you do use the US basing, which these rules certainly do, there is no need to have any special size elements or use of strength point markers with these rules. What I really like about this particular basing system was the attempt to get infantry and cavalry frontages correct. Other rules can only achieve this by the use of different scales for cavalry and infantry, or simply ignore the whole topic. I do like the rules and the system, but when I mainly used to use US basing elements, and as a result I had to use strength point markers when I used my standard 4cm wide bases. When I received 2 hits, in that case I removed the entire, what for these rules are, a double width element. When using the UK basing, you do not typically base 2 ranks deep, although I do have some DBN force mixes or elements which are double ranked and can use these figures, but I lack enough for more than a small battle, and actually I'm at the present moment in the process of converting those figures into the US system. Creating a force mix of 50 elements of compact order infantry, each of which contains 8 figures, is a lot of figures. I prefer to have 2 force mixes than a single double base force mix, but the massive figures do look nice if a bit cluttered. It's all about player preference. The Rules Napoleon, which came out in 2009, is a more recent 25mm focus set of rules which comes from the UK and uses the 2-rank system, common in the US. I expect there is a suggested 15mm basing system, which may well be similar to the US basing system, except here the infantry base is square. This also represents a new basing system, which has not really progressed beyond these rules. The rules 1805 are designed for 10mm figures and have gone down the path of small bases. I assume to allow for play on a small playing area. I'm showing the 6mm figures on the bases. 10mm figures may be a bit tight, but I'm assuming they are supposed to be in 2 ranks. There is a point going down the small base path. It allows you to have standard games in a smaller playing area, but from experience the small elements are very fiddly. 2cm wide bases are too small unless they're deeper than 2cm, which these are not. Nice idea, but I think most players went down the path of bigger bases, which represent larger formations, rather than this system, which achieves much the same thing, even though you get more of a board game feel set of rules. One of the more so-called recent set of rules have gone back to an old basing system, DBN version 2.1. This uses a version of the DBA rules basing system, which is element bases and all elements being the same width. These rules are element based, so the figure density on each base is not important. The important thing is to understand what the element is supposed to represent. I personally can't fit 4 cavalry figures on a single base, so adopting a reduced density for cavalry, such as 3 for heavy cavalry, 2 for light cavalry and 1 per scouting cavalry or skirmish cavalry, seems to work. It basically does not matter, and even the 3cm wide 3-figure bases can be used as long as everyone uses the same bases. This system has become common in figure gaming. Well, not super common, but it's becoming a little bit more common than the past. I'm not quite sure how overwhelmingly successful DBN will be. I was very keen about the rules, but has since kind of dropped my interest. Anyway, it's something to observe. In order to try and deal with the plethora of basing systems used for 15mm, you can find charts on the internet, such as this chart. Charcot provides a similar guideline. This shows three basing or basic basing systems: the 3cm wide, a 4cm wide, and the 2cm wide double ranked. Based on this, the optimal basing system, at least for me initially, was the 4cm wide base. Doubling the base allows you to get the 2-rank effect, and if you need to take half base casualties, you can simply use a counter to indicate this. Indicate one loss, and on the second loss you remove the entire base. However, this does not allow you to play rules which require 3cm wide bases. These days, I personally feel the 2cm wide double depth or double ranked base is probably optimal. This shows the common cavalry basing. The 4cm wide cavalry base seems to be the most universal, at least where I game. I personally have never seen cavalry based on 2 ranks for 15mm, so I'm uncertain what rules support the basing on the right. But clearly there must be at least one set of rules. Actually, after I created this original video, I did discover this is the basing for Napoleon's War, and one of my compatriots who used to play this in the day does actually have his basing or his cavalry based in that manner. However, we virtually never use his cavalry. I just think the bases are far too deep. Finally, we can come to the artillery basing chart, which can be 3cm wide or 4cm wide. The recommendation at the bottom is wise. Keeping the base width all the same does make life easier on many levels for pretty much any set of rules. The one aspect of basing which I think is a real gap is how to depict skirmishing troops in skirmish mode. This depends on scale and is only an issue if you're using a set of rules where the figure scale is under, let's say, 100 men. Scales above this would build the skirmishers into the combat system and the standard basing would be more than adequate. However, if playing a set of rules with a figure scale of 100 men per figure or under, I must admit I like the idea of historically accurate skirmish element basing. If we go back to a rather old set of rules like WRG, but using 4cm wide bases, then a skirmish screen would look as follows. One element of 4 figures would convert into 4 single-figure skirmish elements. If there was a loss in the front line, the 4th skirmish element would take its place. Currently, you need to deploy 2 two-figure half bases in front, and while perfectly acceptable for the rules, it does not look as nice. If your bases are nice enough, you can almost achieve the same effect as 6mm big bases, which allow you to add diorama on your bases for your skirmishers, if you so desire. The manufacturer of rather high quality range of 6mm figures have created a basing standard for those figures called the Polymos basing system. This system uses either 6cm wide bases or 4cm wide bases. This shows the 6 centimetre wide bases. There is also a 6 centimetre square basing system which can be duplicated by the use of 2 of these bases butted up together, one behind the other. The basic principle of this basing standard is good. For 6mm figure, everyone uses the same bases and can play the entire range of rules available from this particular manufacturer, which happens to be Bacchus. The 4cm wide bases are probably used to allow players to use their figures for other rules, but there is no reason why players can't simply use their 6 cm wide bases and play using 25mm scale for these other rules. There are issues, especially with fire ranges, but house rules may be able to resolve those issues to an extent, if players want to go down this particular path. I must admit I do like the idea of a universal 6mm basing system which is applicable to all 6mm sets of rules. However, it's probably not optimal for rules designed for 15 or 25mm figures and does require other 6mm rules providers to align with this basing system, which is probably unlikely. Drilling down to the 6mm figures, this shows the Napoleonic Duchy of Warsaw Army Pack using the 6 cm wide basing. This does not really show the effect of mass 6mm figures, but gives you an idea of the basing recommendations by the manufacturers of these figures. In this case, we show examples of the 4 cm wide basing system used for 6mm figures. This is almost certainly the most universal basing system possible, but personally, if I was going to go down the 4 cm wide bases, I'd probably stay with 15mm figures. I still think 6mm on 6cm wide bases is the true sweet spot for 6mm, or alternatively on 3cm wide bases. But the big bases from a pure looks point of view does look very impressive. From a rules point of view, the logical gamer would always base on 4cm wide bases so they could use their figures for as many different rules as they possibly can. The topic of basing, particularly Napoleonic, is a perennial one, and as a result I've created more than my fair share of videos on the topic. Some of them are listed here, although the names may have changed. However, before I end this video, some eye candy may be in order. I found these images on the internet and I must admit the figures are very nice indeed. This shows Napoleonic Austrian Jager. I'm uncertain what basing they use, but they certainly do look nice. More Napoleonic Austrian skirmishers. This looks like a double width skirmish base, although the number of figures are quite substantial. This shows a Grenz infantry regiment. This uses the 4-figure, 2-rank basing system. Grenz are light infantry, but this is clearly their compact order. They also fought in a close order form as well. This shows some of the skirmishers from the Grenz infantry regiment. Clearly these figures must be double base, this being a skirmish base. I like the idea as the playing area does look a lot better as a result. For those interested in what gamers probably used back in the 1970s, here's a packet of Airfix figures. 1/72 scale, which is 20mm figures, were reasonably common in the old days, although they were normally based 1 figure per base. With modern paints you can actually do a good job making Airfix plastic figures look good. I only wish that I didn't throw all my figures away back in the day, as I must have had hundreds of figures from all sorts of periods. And so we come to an end of my episode 43 of my video series on game design theory, in this case a historical view of Napoleonic rules basing systems. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.